Let's start with a question. How far would you go to obey someone in power? Would you hurt someone if an authority figure told you to? Most of us would confidently say no, but in 1961, a psychologist named Stanley Milgram set out to test this, and the results were horrifying. Here's how it worked. Volunteers were told they'd be part of a study on memory. They were placed in front of a machine with switches labeled from mild to danger, severe shock. Their job? Deliver electric shocks to a person in another room whenever they answered a question wrong. Now here's the twist. The person receiving the shocks wasn't real. It was an actor pretending to scream in pain, but the volunteers didn't know that. They thought they were genuinely hurting someone. And when the actor begged to stop, what did most people do? They turned to the man in the lab coat. He simply said, "Please continue." And they did. Most of the participants went further than anyone expected. 65% of them flipped the switch all the way to the maximum voltage, believing they might be killing someone, just because an authority figure told them to. This experiment shattered the illusion that people are naturally good. It proved that under the right circumstances, ordinary people could be made to do unthinkable things. And here's the scary part. This isn't just history, it's happening every day. Think about how often we blindly follow authority figures in our own lives. It's not just about governments or police, it's in marketing, workplaces, and even personal relationships. When a doctor tells you to take a certain medication, you don't question it. When a boss gives instructions, you do them without pushing back. Why? Because Milgram showed us that authority is one of the most powerful psychological triggers we have. And the people who understand this, they use it to control you. But if you want to talk about control, the Stanford Prison Experiment is on a different level. What happens when people are given too much power, or when they think they have none at all? In 1971, psychologist Philip Zimbardo created one of the most infamous experiments in history, the Stanford Prison Experiment. Here's the setup. 24 college students were randomly assigned to be either guards or prisoners in a mock prison. Zimbardo transformed the basement of Stanford University into a crude jail. There were cells, uniforms, and even rules to follow. The guards were told to maintain order, but they weren't given much guidance beyond that. The prisoners, stripped of their identities, referred to only by numbers, and locked in cells. What was supposed to be a harmless 2-week study spiraled out of control in just 6 days. The guards became sadistic. They yelled, humiliated, and even physically punished the prisoners. One guard later admitted he started inventing ways to make the prisoners suffer, just to see how far he could push them. The prisoners, on the other hand, became submissive and hopeless. They stopped resisting, internalized the abuse, and acted like they truly were criminals. Some even had full-blown mental breakdowns. The experiment ended early, but the damage was done. Zimbardo had proven something chilling. People don't just play roles, they become them. When you give someone power without accountability, they'll abuse it. And when you strip someone of their identity, they'll accept it. This dynamic isn't confined to fake prisons. You see it in real ones, in corporate hierarchies, even in relationships where one person dominates the other. The Stanford Prison Experiment taught us that power corrupts, and that submission is just as dangerous. The question is, are you the guard, the prisoner, or the one pulling the strings? Next on the list is the Skinner box experiment. In the 1940s, psychologist B.F. Skinner developed something called the operant conditioning chamber, better known as the Skinner box. It was a small enclosure where animals, usually rats or pigeons, were placed to test how rewards and punishments could shape their behavior. Here's how it worked. A rat would be put in the box with a lever. If it pressed the lever, it might receive a food pellet. But sometimes pressing the lever would result in nothing, or even a mild electric shock. Over time, Skinner discovered that the most effective way to condition behavior wasn't constant rewards or punishments. It was unpredictability. When the rat didn't know whether the lever would reward it or punish it, it became obsessed with pressing it. The uncertainty created a psychological loop, a compulsion to try again and again in the hope of a reward. Sound familiar? It should. Because this same principle is the backbone of how social media, gambling, and even video games are designed today. Think about your phone. Every time you check it, you're pulling a virtual lever. Will you see a new notification, a like on your post, a message from someone important? You don't know, and that's exactly why you keep checking. Why does this work? Because humans are wired to seek out patterns and rewards. When the reward is unpredictable, your brain gets a dopamine hit every time you try. It's addictive, and it's deliberate. The Skinner box might have started with rats, but today, we're all living in one, built by companies that profit off of your compulsions. The only difference is that the lever is now in your pocket. Let's move on to a psychological experiment so cruel, it was hidden from the public for years. In 1939, Wendell Johnson and his team at the University of Iowa conducted what's now known as the Monster Study. Their goal? To study the effects of positive and negative reinforcement on children's speech. Here's how it worked. They took 22 orphan children and divided them into two groups. One group received positive reinforcement, being praised for their speech fluency, encouraged, and told they were excellent speakers. The other group? They were humiliated, berated, and told they had speech problems, even if they didn't. The results were devastating. The children in the negative reinforcement group began stuttering, even if they had spoken fluently before. They developed deep anxiety about speaking at all, and many carried those scars into adulthood. Why is this so disturbing? Because it proves how deeply words can shape a person's reality. By planting a seed of doubt, even in something as basic as speech, you can fundamentally alter how someone sees themselves. Now you might think, that's just history. No one's doing that today. But are you sure? Think about how often people weaponize criticism to control others. A parent telling their child, "You'll never amount to anything." A boss constantly pointing out mistakes but never offering praise. Even subtle comments like, "You always do this wrong," can plant seeds of self-doubt that grow into something much bigger. The Monster Study wasn't just an experiment, it was a warning. Words can cut deeper than actions, and those who understand that can use it to break someone or build them into exactly what they want. Let's take it a step further and talk about how easy it is to manipulate entire groups of people into conflict and then control the outcome. In 1954, psychologists Muzaffar and Carolyn Sharif conducted what's known as the Robber's Cave experiment, a study on group behavior that spiraled into something much darker. They took 22 boys, all around 11 years old, and split them into two groups. Each group was sent to a summer camp and kept completely separate from the other. At first, they had no idea the other group even existed, but once they found out, the experiment began. The researchers pitted the groups against each other in competitions, things like tug-of-war and treasure hunts, and as you might expect, things got ugly fast. The boys started hurling insults, raiding each other's cabins, and even sabotaging each other's property. But here's where it gets interesting. Once the researchers had created chaos, they stepped in as the mediators. They staged a crisis, like a water supply issue, that forced the boys to work together. Suddenly, the hostility faded, and the two groups started cooperating. What does this show? Conflict doesn't just happen, it can be engineered, and the person who controls the conflict controls the outcome. Politicians use this tactic all the time, create division, then step in as the solution. You see it in workplaces too. Managers playing favorites to create competition among employees, then swooping in to fix the tension. This experiment proves one thing: whoever creates the problem has the power to solve it, and that gives them control. But what happens when the people pulling the strings don't stop at conflict? What if they want to control your mind itself? Let's talk about something that sounds straight out of a conspiracy theory, but isn't. MKUltra. Now we're entering the territory of mind control, quite literally. MKUltra wasn't just an experiment. It was a covert CIA program designed to manipulate human behavior through drugs, hypnosis, and psychological torture. And here's the scariest part. It actually happened. Launched in the 1950s, MKUltra was the CIA's response to Cold War paranoia. They wanted to figure out how to control people's minds, how to make them spill secrets, obey commands, or even erase their own memories. To do this, they experimented on unsuspecting individuals, often without their consent. One infamous example involved dosing subjects with LSD without telling them. These subjects, many of whom were prisoners or patients in mental hospitals, were left in a state of confusion, terror, or even permanent psychological damage. But MKUltra didn't stop at drugs. The program also tested sensory deprivation, electroshock therapy, and sleep manipulation, all with the goal of breaking a person's will and reprogramming their mind. Why is this relevant today? Because the psychological principles behind MKUltra are still being used, just in less obvious ways. Think about how your attention is manipulated. Social media algorithms are designed to keep you scrolling, bombarding you with dopamine hits one moment and fear-inducing content the next. This cycle keeps you hooked, much like the subjects of MKUltra were controlled through a mix of pleasure and pain. MKUltra might have been shut down, but the blueprint it left behind is alive and well. The difference? Today, you're willingly participating. But while MKUltra tried to control individuals, our next experiment shows how even the smallest nudge can manipulate entire populations. Let's look at a modern experiment that hits much closer to home, one that involves you, me, and the social media we use every day. In 2012, Facebook conducted an experiment on nearly 700,000 users without their knowledge. Their goal? To see if they could manipulate people's emotions simply by tweaking what appeared in their news feeds. Here's how it worked. Facebook divided users into groups. Some saw mostly positive posts from friends, while others were shown primarily negative ones. The results were as unsettling as they were effective. Users who saw positive posts started sharing more upbeat content themselves. Those bombarded with negativity, their own posts became darker and more pessimistic. Facebook had effectively proven that emotions are contagious and that they had the power to control how millions of people felt, all with a few subtle changes to an algorithm. Now think about what this means in a larger context. Social media platforms don't just reflect your mood, they shape it. By amplifying certain emotions, they can nudge you towards specific behaviors, like staying on the app longer, buying a product, or even voting a certain way. This wasn't just an experiment, it was a blueprint for emotional manipulation on a massive scale, and it worked. But if Facebook can influence your emotions with something as small as a news feed, imagine what happens when someone deliberately engineers your entire reality. That brings us to our final and darkest experiment. Imagine sitting in a room with 7 other people, looking at a simple question with an obvious answer. There are 3 lines on a card, and you're asked to match one of them to a standard line. Easy, right? But here's the catch. The 7 people before you are all in on the experiment, and they're deliberately giving the wrong answer. When it's your turn, do you stick to what you know is right, or do you go along with the group? In the 1950s, Solomon Asch ran this exact experiment. The results were staggering. About 75% of participants conformed to the group at least once, even when the answer was clearly wrong. Why did this happen? Because humans are wired to seek social harmony. Going against the group triggers feelings of isolation and anxiety, and most people will do anything to avoid that. Now apply this to real life. Think about how often people agree with the majority, even when they know it's wrong. It's not just peer pressure, it's a survival instinct. Whether it's in a boardroom, a social media debate, or even a jury room, the fear of standing out can override logic. This experiment shows how fragile our sense of independence really is, and how easily someone who controls the majority can control you. The Asch conformity experiment may seem harmless, but it reveals a dark truth. We're more likely to sacrifice our own beliefs than risk being the outsider. And in the wrong hands, that's a terrifying amount of power. These experiments may feel like they belong in history books or conspiracy theories, but the truth is, they're alive and well in the world around us. Whether it's through authority, social pressure, emotional manipulation, or engineered chaos, the principles behind these studies are used every day to influence how you think, feel, and act, often without you even noticing. The question is, what will you do with this knowledge? Will you let it open your eyes to the hidden strings in your life, or will you let those strings keep pulling you? If nothing else, remember this. The more you understand human psychology, the harder it becomes for anyone to control you. Stay curious, stay skeptical, and most importantly, stay in control.